The saloon went dead quiet the moment she said it, not the kind of quiet that comes from a lull in conversation, the natural ebb and flow of men drinking and cards being dealt. This was the kind of quiet that falls like a stone through ice, sudden and total and cold. Every head turned. Every glass paused halfway to every mouth. Even the piano player, a sour-faced man named Gus who had been plinking out the same 3 songs since sundown, let his fingers still on the keys. She was standing in the center of the room, her dress torn at the shoulder seam, her hair half down from whatever pins had been holding it up when she first arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, 2 weeks ago. Her chin was trembling, but her eyes were not. Her eyes were burning with something that had moved past grief into a territory most people never visited, a place where humiliation and fury and desperate loneliness fuse into a single unbearable thing. "Does anyone here even know my name?" She said it to the room, but she was looking at him. Marshal Dylan Ivers stood at the far end of the bar with one hand resting flat on the counter and the other hanging loose at his side, close to the holster he had not touched in 3 days, which was something of a record for Caldwell in the summer of 1882. He was 32 years old and had the kind of face that weather and consequence had carved into something that looked more like a statement than a person. Sharp jaw, eyes the color of good gun metal, a mouth that rarely moved for anything other than orders or judgments. He stared at her. He did not answer, nobody answered, and that was, he would understand much later, the exact moment everything changed. Not in the room, in him. Her name was Penelope Ashford, and he had known it for 11 days. 3 weeks earlier, Penelope Ashford had stepped off the southbound stage from Wichita with 2 leather bags. A letter of introduction from a lawyer named Caldwell had never heard of, and the particular kind of careful composure that people wear when they are holding themselves together by force of will alone. She was 26. She had dark hair and dark eyes and a mouth that looked like it had spent a long time trying not to say things it meant. She was not fragile, though several men in town initially mistook her quietness for fragility, which was a mistake they would each come to regret in their own ways. She was deliberate. She watched. She had learned, somewhere along the road that had led her here, that watching was safer than speaking. The lawyer's letter was from a man named Gerald Foss in Wichita, and it stated that Miss Penelope Ashford was the legal heir to a 40-acre parcel of land on the western edge of Caldwell County, left to her by her mother's older brother, a man named Thomas Ashford, who had died without a will, but not without enemies. Thomas Ashford had been running a small cattle operation on that land for 6 years. The land itself was worth something modest. What was under part of it, a spring-fed creek that hadn't been on any official survey yet, was worth considerably more. Dylan Ivers had been Marshal of Caldwell for 4 years. He had been marshalling in one capacity or another since he was 24, first in Dodge City, then briefly in Abilene, then here. He had a reputation that had been built deliberately, stone by stone, the way a man builds a wall when he knows he needs to keep things out. He was fair. He was efficient. He was ruthless when the situation called for it, and the situation in Caldwell called for it more often than the town liked to admit. He did not make friends. He did not make enemies, not the kind that lasted, because enemies tended not to survive long enough in Caldwell to become permanent. He also did not make conversation, not with strangers, not with townspeople, sometimes not even with his deputy, a young man named Chester Munn, who had made a careful study of when to speak to the marshal and when to find somewhere else to be. When Penelope Ashford walked into his office on her second day in Caldwell to report that someone had been on her uncle's property the night before, leaving boot tracks around the barn and a door off its hinges, Dylan Ivers had listened to her story, written 3 lines in his ledger book, told her he would look into it, and dismissed her. He had not asked her name. She had given it anyway, clearly and carefully, the way a person does when they know it matters and suspect it won't be remembered. Penelope Ashford. I'm at the Birch House Hotel until I can get the farmstead in order. Miss Ashford, he had said, and written it down. And that was the end of it. He went out to the property the following morning, found the tracks, identified them as belonging to a large man with worn boot heels who favored his left side, probably from an old injury. Found where a fence post had been pulled and replaced. Found nothing else useful and reported back to her with exactly those findings. She had looked at him with those watchful dark eyes and said, "Do you think it will happen again?" "Probably," he had said, which was the honest answer, and had left. What he did not tell her, because it was not information he had any obligation to share with a civilian, was that he already knew who had been on her property. The large man with the worn heel was almost certainly in the employ of a rancher named Harold Stokes, who owned the 2 largest cattle operations in the county, and had been making informal inquiries about purchasing Thomas Ashford's land for the past year. Harold Stokes was not a violent man by nature, but he was an acquisitive one, and he had a foreman named Ray Dunbar who had a talent for making things complicated for people who stood in Harold Stokes's way. Dylan knew this. He was watching it. He was building a case quietly, the way he built most things, carefully and without announcement. What he had not accounted for was Penelope Ashford. He had expected her to behave the way people usually behaved when they inherited land they didn't understand in a town they didn't know. He had expected her to be frightened and uncertain, to either sell quickly and leave or else dig in with the kind of stubborn unfamiliarity that would make his job harder. He had expected her to come to him repeatedly, with questions he couldn't answer and demands he couldn't meet. Instead, she had gone to the land herself. She had hired 2 men from the livery to help her clear the barn. She had introduced herself to her nearest neighbor, a widow named Clara Mabry who ran a small garden and orchard 3 miles east. She had eaten at the town restaurant every evening alone and paid for her meals with exact coin. She had not come back to his office. He had noticed all of this. He had told himself he was noticing because it was relevant to the case he was building. He had told himself this several times and believed it a little less each time. On the 6th day she was in Caldwell, Ray Dunbar walked into the restaurant while she was eating supper and sat down at her table without being invited. Dylan saw it through the window from across the street. He crossed slowly, watching through the glass. He could see Dunbar talking, leaning forward with the particular posture of a man who is making things clear. He could see Penelope Ashford listening, her fork set down on her plate, her hands folded in her lap, her face perfectly controlled. He pushed through the restaurant door. Dunbar looked up. Half the restaurant looked up. Dylan stood in the doorway and said, "Dunbar, step outside." Dunbar stepped outside. They had a brief conversation in which Dylan explained, in specific and unhurried terms, the legal dimensions of trespassing on private property, and the particular varieties of legal consequence available to Dylan personally regarding individuals who chose to interfere with that property or its rightful owner. Dunbar was smart enough to hear the actual meaning under the lawful language and left without further conversation. Dylan went back inside. He stopped at Penelope's table. "He won't bother you tonight," he said. She looked up at him, and he saw something move through her expression, something quick and complicated before the careful composure came back. "Thank you, Marshal," she said. He nodded and left. He told himself, walking back to his office in the darkening evening, that it was his job. The trouble was that it kept being his job in ways that required him to be near her. He needed to monitor the property, which meant riding past it most mornings. He needed to keep track of Stokes's movements, which meant tracking information through people who did business in the same places Penelope did. He needed to understand the full picture of what Stokes wanted and why, which meant understanding the land itself. And the only person who had access to all of Thomas Ashford's papers and surveys was Penelope. On the 9th day, he went to the farmstead and asked to see the surveys. She spread them on the kitchen table in the farmhouse that she had clearly been working to make livable. There were fresh, washed curtains at the window and a new latch on the door, and they stood side by side over the papers, while she pointed out what she understood and what she didn't. She smelled like soap and warm cotton and something faintly like lavender. He noticed this in the way he noticed everything, automatically and without sentiment, and filed it away in the same place he filed things he did not intend to think about. She was smart about the land. Smarter than he had expected, though he would later be ashamed of having expected less. She had been studying the surveys herself, had noticed the discrepancy between the original homestead plot and the county records, had already written back to Gerald Foss in Wichita, asking for clarification on the water rights. "My uncle never told my mother much about this place," she said, tracing her finger along one of the hand-drawn property lines. "They were not close, but he left it to her, and she died before she could claim it, so now it's mine." She paused. "I don't know if that means it belongs to me or if it means it needs to belong to me. There's a difference." Dylan looked at her. "What kind of difference?" She considered the question as if it deserved a real answer. "Whether I'm here because it's legally mine, or whether I'm here because it's the place I'm supposed to be. The first is a right, the second is something else." He did not know what to say to that. He was not accustomed to people saying things he did not know what to do with. He folded the surveys back into their case and told her he would be in touch regarding the water rights question, and left. He thought about what she had said for the next 2 days. He told himself he was thinking about it strategically, in terms of what it meant for the case. He kept thinking about it anyway, past the point where the case explained it. On the 11th day, Harold Stokes came to his office. Harold Stokes was a large man in his middle 50s, with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to fight particularly hard for anything, because he had been bigger and wealthier than everyone around him for most of his life. He was not cruel. He was thoughtless in the specific way of men who have never needed to consider other people's positions carefully. He sat in the chair across from Dylan's desk and set his hat on his knee and said he wanted to talk about the Ashford property. "I want to buy it," Stokes said. "I've made a fair offer. More than fair given the condition of the place. The girl's new in town, she doesn't know what she's got. I'm prepared to pay $1,200. Dylan sat with his hands folded on his desk. "The property is not for sale, Mr. Stokes. I haven't asked her yet." "You've sent your foreman to make the point twice, which is 2 times past the moment it became my business." Dylan held the man's gaze steadily. "The property is not for sale because Miss Ashford has made no indication of intending to sell it. If that changes, it changes between her and a buyer of her choosing. It does not change because Ray Dunbar sits down at her supper table uninvited." Stokes turned his hat on his knee, a slow rotation that was the only sign of his irritation. "The water rights on that creek are worth 10 times the land," he said. "You know that and I know that. She doesn't know it yet, and when she does, she'll be in a difficult position." "Why difficult?" Dylan said. "Because a woman alone on 40 acres with a water rights dispute can find things get complicated quickly." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Dylan said, "Harold, hear me carefully. If things get complicated for Miss Ashford in any way that has your fingerprints on it, I will burn your operations to the ground with legal fire. I know your survey manipulations going back 3 years. I know about the cattle dispute with the Morrison family. I know about the arrangement with the county assessor." He paused. "So I would like you to hear the word complicated in both directions." Stokes stood up. His face was red, but his voice stayed even. "I'm making a legitimate business offer." "Then make it legitimately," Dillon said, out loud. "In writing, with a fair price, to her, directly. And if she says no, you accept it, and that's the end of the matter." Stokes left without another word. Dillon watched him go and thought that it would not be the end of the matter and began making plans accordingly. He did not tell Penelope about the conversation. He should have. He would think about this later, carefully and critically, turning it over in his mind, examining the reasons he had told himself at the time. He had told himself she didn't need to be frightened. He had told himself he had the situation in hand. He had told himself it would be better to wait until he had more to tell her. What he had not admitted to himself was the truth, which was simpler and more uncomfortable than any of those reasons. He had wanted, for just a little longer, to be the thing standing between her and the world's difficulty. He had wanted to handle it. He had wanted to be the reason she was safe without her having to know how unsafe she was. It was the most self-indulgent thing he had done in years, and he did not recognize it as self-indulgence, because he had been keeping his own feelings behind a wall so long he had forgotten how to identify them. Harold Stokes's idea of legitimate turned out to be a legal document sent through a Wichita lawyer claiming that the water rights on the creek had been verbally promised to the Stokes cattle operation by Thomas Ashford before his death, and demanding that Penelope vacate those rights within 30 days or face litigation. It arrived at the Birch House Hotel by courier on a Wednesday evening. Penelope read it twice at the front desk while the desk clerk pretended not to watch. Then she folded it, put it in her pocket, went upstairs, and came back down wearing her coat. She walked to the marshal's office. Chester Munn, the deputy, was at the front desk. She asked for the marshal. Chester told her the marshal was not in, which was true. She asked where the marshal was. Chester hesitated, which was his habit when he was caught between two different sources of authority, and finally said that the marshal was probably at the saloon because Thursday evenings were when Dillon met with two of the town's business leaders about various matters. Thursday was Wednesday's neighbor, and the saloon was 3 doors down, and Penelope walked there directly. The saloon in Caldwell in 1882 was called the Silver Rail, and it was a functioning establishment that had managed, through some combination of the marshal's firm presence and the owner's practical good sense, to exist slightly above the level of violence that characterized many frontier drinking establishments. There were tables and a bar and a piano. There were men drinking and men playing cards. There were 2 women who worked there whose profession Penelope understood clearly and regarded without judgment, because she had been in enough difficult positions herself to know better than to judge other women for the positions circumstance put them in. She walked in. She looked for him. She found him at the far end of the bar, talking in low tones with 2 men she didn't know. He saw her come in. She saw him see her. His face did not change. She waited for him to come to her or to indicate she should come to him. He did neither. He turned back to his conversation. She stood there for 5 minutes, the legal document in her coat pocket, while the evening continued around her, and nobody spoke to her, and nobody made room for her, and nobody acknowledged that she existed in that room at all. The 2 women who worked at the Silver Rail were the only ones who even met her eyes, and their expressions were carefully neutral, the particular neutrality of women who have learned to measure which battles are theirs to fight. She had been 2 weeks in this town. She had eaten her meals alone and filed her reports with the Marshal's office, and worked her land and asked careful questions of the hardware merchant and the feed store operator, and had introduced herself at least a dozen times. She had been efficient and polite and undemanding. She had tried to be the kind of person a town lets in. She felt the document folded against her ribs. She felt the weight of 2 weeks of namelessness pressing on her like a physical thing. "Does anyone here even know my name?" The room went silent. She was looking at him. And she watched him stand there in that awful quiet and not answer. And something in her expression shifted from burning into something colder and more final. And she turned and walked out. He was on his feet and moving before the door had finished swinging shut. He caught up with her on the boardwalk outside. The evening was purple-gray and warm, and the street was still busy with the ordinary motion of a Thursday, horses at hitching posts, lanterns in windows, a wagon moving slowly at the far end of the road. "Miss Ashford," he said. She kept walking. "Penelope," she stopped. Her back was still to him. A long moment passed. She turned around. Her face was composed in a way that cost her. He could see the cost. "My name," she said quietly, "is not a thing you earn the right to use at the moment it becomes useful to you." He had no argument for that. He stood in the street and felt the accuracy of it like a wound. "You're right," he said. That surprised her. He could see it in the small shift of her posture. She had been braced for deflection or justification. He stepped closer. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that they were talking and not projecting. "I know your name," he said. "Penelope Ashford. You arrived on the 4th of July stage. You're staying at Birch House. You own 40 acres on the western county edge that your uncle left your mother, and you've been cleaning out the barn by yourself for a week and a half." He paused. "I know Harold Stokes sent a legal document tonight claiming verbal water rights. I should have told you that was coming. I didn't." That was wrong. She stared at him. The fury in her face had not gone entirely, but something else had entered it, something uncertain and listening. "Why didn't you?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Honest answer or safe answer? The wall or the truth? "Because I was handling it, and I wanted you to be able to just work your land without carrying the knowledge of the trouble," he said. "Which was not my decision to make." She was quiet for a moment, studying him with those dark eyes that had clearly spent a long time learning to read people accurately. "You thought you were protecting me." "I was handling it," he said, which was not quite the same thing, and she clearly knew it. "Marshal Ivers," she said slowly. "I am 26 years old, and I have been handling my own circumstances since I was 17. I have buried my mother. I have managed an estate that had more debt than asset. I have traveled alone to a town where I knew no one to claim land that I needed in order to have a future." Her voice was controlled, but there was emotion moving under it like water under ice. "I do not need protection from information. I need someone to talk to me like I matter." He said, "You matter." The words came out before his considered self could measure them, too direct and too plain, and he saw them land in her expression like something unexpected and slightly alarming. "Come to my office in the morning," he said, quickly, professionally, back on known ground. "I'll show you everything I have on Stokes. The legal document is likely not enforceable, and I know someone in Wichita who can verify that. But you need to know the full picture." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded once and walked away toward the Birch House. Dylan stood in the street and watched her go and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. He identified it reluctantly. It felt, uncomfortably and unmistakably, like the specific fear of losing something you have only just understood you wanted. She came to his office the next morning at 8 o'clock, which was when he had asked her to come, and also, he realized as he watched her walk through the door, precisely when he had spent the night expecting her. He had reorganized his files the previous evening. He had put the relevant materials in order. He had made coffee, which he did not always bother with, and had his deputy make himself scarce. He showed her everything. He laid out Stokes's history, the previous land disputes, the survey manipulation, the arrangement with the county assessor. He showed her the water rights question and his own analysis, based on the surveys she had shared and some additional research he had done, that the creek was almost certainly hers by the original homestead grant, and that no verbal agreement with a dead man could override a written legal claim. He wrote down the name of a lawyer in Wichita, a man named Samuel Pratt, who was both honest and skilled, and told her to contact him directly. She sat across from his desk and listened to all of it without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, all of them specific and well considered. She took notes in a small leather-bound book she pulled from her coat pocket. When he was done, she looked at the notes for a moment and then looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "It's my job." "Some of this," she said carefully, "goes considerably beyond what a marshal is obligated to do for a property dispute." He held her gaze. "Some of it does," he admitted. Something moved in her expression, quiet and warm and careful. She looked back at her notes. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was different from the controlled civility she had been using since she arrived. It was softer and more direct. It was the voice of a person speaking to another person rather than to a stranger. He felt that fear again, the specific losing something fear, and recognized that what he was afraid of losing was specifically this, the possibility that was sitting in this room and that he was entirely unprepared for. "The other thing," he said, and paused. This was where he should stop. This was where the professional boundary lived. "The other thing is that you should not have to stand in a room full of people and ask if anyone knows your name." She was very still. "That question," he said, "should not have needed to be asked. You've been in this town for 2 weeks, and you've handled yourself with more steadiness and sense than half the people who have lived here for years, and the town has treated you like a temporary inconvenience." His voice was even, but there was something uneven under it. "That's not something I can fix with a marshal's badge, but I can be sorry for my part in it." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and he became aware that his hands were flat on the desk, and his heart was doing something irregular. "Your part in it," she said slowly, "was that you knew my name and said nothing. But it was also the only time someone in this town has apologized to me for anything. So I think your part might also be the beginning of the other thing." He did not know exactly how to interpret that sentence. He was fairly certain she had just offered him something, and he was also fairly certain he had no idea how to accept it gracefully, because graceful acceptance was not a skill he had developed any particular facility with. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Penelope," she said, with the slight edge of someone reclaiming a thing. "Penelope," he said, and the word was strange and good in his mouth. "I would like, if you are agreeable, to have dinner with you this evening, at the restaurant, as myself and not as the marshal, if you are agreeable." He had said "if you are agreeable" twice. He noticed this and found it mortifying. She looked at the faint horror in his expression, and something moved through her own that might, under different circumstances, have become a smile. "Yes," she said, "I'm agreeable." He stood in the doorway of his own office and watched her walk out into the morning and thought, with the plain, stunned clarity of a man who has just stepped off a ledge, that he was in considerable trouble. The dinner was at 6:30 at the restaurant, which was called the Caldwell House, and served food that was reliably good by frontier standards. Dillon wore his clean shirt and his good coat, and spent 15 minutes before leaving his quarters behind the marshal's office arguing internally with himself about the coat, ultimately keeping it on. and feeling the particular absurdity of a man who had faced armed criminals without flinching being undone by a coat. Penelope was already there when he arrived. She had changed her dress to one that was a deep brown with cream at the collar, and she had her hair up properly, and she looked, to his unprepared eye, remarkable. He noticed this in a way that was not at all like the way he noticed things professionally. He sat down across from her and they looked at each other for a moment, and then she said, "This is where it becomes difficult," and he was so relieved by her directness that he felt the tension in his shoulders release. "The dinner," he said. "The explaining," she said. "I know very little about you except that you are effective and occasionally infuriating. You know rather more about me than is strictly comfortable, and we are supposed to have a normal dinner." "I'm not good at normal dinners," he said honestly. "Neither am I," she said. "I've been eating alone for 2 weeks. Before that," he asked. She looked at him. "I was in Wichita for 3 years managing my mother's estate. Before that, St. Louis. My father died when I was 20, my mother a year ago." She said it plainly, not asking for sympathy but not hiding it either. "I've been on my own for some time." He absorbed this carefully. "No one waiting in St. Louis or Wichita." "No," she said. "You?" "No," he said. He thought about leaving it there. He thought about offering the abbreviated version that was technically accurate. Then he looked at her patient, watching expression and said, "There was someone 7 years ago in Dodge City. She left because I was never going to be anyone other than a Marshal, and she needed someone who could be home and present. She was right to leave. I was not easy to be with." He paused. "I'm not sure that's changed. The not being easy part or the being a Marshal part." "Either," he said with the honesty of a man who has thought about this fairly carefully. She looked at her hands on the table for a moment. "I'm not particularly easy either," she said. "I have opinions that I'm not good at pretending I don't have. I make decisions that I don't always explain. I need to know things. I don't do well with being managed." "I know that," he said. "I have a fairly specific recent example." She looked up at him, and this time the thing that moved through her expression did become a small smile, brief and real and startling in its effect on him. They ate and they talked. The conversation was careful at first, the way conversations are between people who are managing an unfamiliar intimacy. But it moved gradually into something more real. He told her about Dodge City, about the years of it, the weight of a cattle town during its most violent period. She told him about St. Louis, about the specific loneliness of a woman managing an estate that the lawyers assumed she couldn't understand, of fighting to be taken seriously in every room she entered. "It's interesting," she said at one point, "that you and I have both been in the business of making rooms listen to us. It just looks different depending on whether you're wearing a badge or a skirt," he said, and then regretted the bluntness, but she nodded. "Yes, exactly. The badge means something immediately. The skirt means the opposite." "That's not right," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." There was a comfortable silence for a moment that surprised them both. Dylan looked at his coffee cup and thought that he could not remember the last time a silence with another person had felt comfortable rather than strategic. "What is your plan for the land?" he asked. Her eyes brightened slightly, the specific brightening of a person asked about something they have been thinking about carefully and at length. "The 40 acres themselves could support a decent small cattle operation. My uncle started it but didn't develop it well." "But the water," she paused. "The creek is reliable year-round according to the neighbors. Clara Mabry says it's never gone dry even in dry summers. With proper water rights secured, the land value is considerably more than $1,200. She looked at him. "Which you already knew." "Yes," he said, "which is why Stokes wants it." "Yes." which means I need to be very careful about how I handle the legal claim and about making sure the rights are properly documented before Stokes's lawyers can create a muddy enough dispute to stall me," she said. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has been proven correct in an assessment he had recently made. "You've thought this through." "I've been thinking about almost nothing else for 2 weeks," she said. "I just didn't have anyone to think through it with." A slight pause. "Until now, apparently." That word, apparently, was doing something very specific, and she seemed aware of it. He was aware of it. They looked at each other across the restaurant table with the particular awareness of two people who have walked into something neither of them planned. He walked her back to the Birch house when the evening ended. They stood on the boardwalk outside in the warm night air, and there was a moment that stretched and filled with possibility. "Thank you," she said, "for the dinner and for the conversation." "Thank you," he said, which he would have found embarrassing to say to almost anyone else in the world. She looked at him, and her expression was open in a way it hadn't been before, the careful composure still there but with something genuine showing through it, something that had been waiting for a reason to show. "Good night, Dylan," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He stood on the boardwalk long after she had gone inside and listened to the ordinary sounds of Caldwell at night and felt, with complete clarity and no small amount of vulnerability, that his life had just been meaningfully altered by a woman in a brown dress who had asked a question that the room hadn't deserved to hear. The next week was not quiet. Samuel Pratt, the lawyer in Wichita that Dylan had recommended, wrote back with a clear and considered opinion that the verbal agreement claim Stokes's lawyers had filed was legally insufficient and almost certainly fabricated. He offered to take the case and suggested that an expedited filing to confirm and record Penelope's water rights would effectively end the dispute before it could gain momentum. Penelope wrote back the same day she received the letter, accepted Pratt's offer, and paid his retainer fee from money she had been keeping carefully since selling some of her mother's furniture in St. Louis. She told Dylan about it on one of his morning rides past the property, leaning out of the barn door with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and sawdust in her hair, and he thought she had never looked more capable or more herself. "Pratt is good," he said from the saddle. "He'll have it filed within 2 weeks. He said 10 days, she said. Then 10 days, he said, and there was a warmth in the exchange that Chester Munn, who was riding with him, observed with the careful neutrality of a young deputy who understood what was happening and knew better than to comment on it. Harold Stokes made one more move. His lawyer sent a second letter, this one more aggressive, suggesting that Thomas Ashford's ownership of the full parcel was itself questionable, and that Penelope's inheritance claim might be disputed. This was, as Dylan explained to Penelope when she came to his office with the letter, and an expression of furious calm, a bluff. The inheritance documentation from Gerald Foss was solid. The original homestead grant was clear. Stokes was throwing legal weight at a wall hoping she would crumble. "He thinks I'll settle," she said. "He thinks you'll be frightened," Dylan corrected, "which he has been consistently wrong about." She looked at him from across the desk. 2 weeks ago, this was the office she had walked into alone and uncertain, giving her name to a man who was going to write it in a ledger and dismiss her. Now she was sitting across from him, and he was telling her she wasn't frightened and meaning it as a compliment, and she was taking it as one. "I've written to Gerald Foss for the original inheritance documents and the death certificate," she said. "I'll have them authenticated through the county clerk and send copies to Pratt." "That's exactly right," he said. "I know," she said, simply and without arrogance, and he looked at her and felt the specific warmth of watching someone know their own competence. Ray Dunbar was seen on the western road near her property twice that week. Both times, Dylan or Chester were present within minutes. On the second occurrence, Dylan had a conversation with Dunbar that was brief and specific, and that Dunbar clearly found memorable, because he was not seen on the Western Road again. On the following Saturday, the town of Caldwell had its monthly social gathering at the church hall, a thing that Clara Mabry had told Penelope about and encouraged her to attend. Penelope had hesitated. The saloon incident had sharpened her awareness of her own namelessness in this town in a way that made the idea of another public gathering uncomfortable. Dylan found her before the gathering and said, "Come, I'll introduce you." She looked at him for a moment. "You're going." "I go every month," he said. "It's part of the job." "And introducing me," she said carefully, "is also part of the job." A pause. "No," he said, "she went." He introduced her to people as Penelope Ashford, owner of the Ashford property on the western edge. And when he said it with the specific tone of a man who is making a thing clear. A tone the people of Caldwell recognized because it was the Marshal's tone, the one that indicated how things were. People responded accordingly. They introduced themselves in return. The storekeeper's wife had heard about the barn clearing and asked about it with genuine curiosity. Clara Mabry arrived and embraced Penelope warmly, which immediately communicated Clara's endorsement to the half-dozen people watching. Dylan stayed near her for most of the evening, not hovering, not performing, but present, and it was the most natural thing he had done in social company in years. He watched her talk to people, watched her be herself, careful and warm and direct and funny when she chose to be, and felt, with the kind of helpless certainty that doesn't ask for your permission, that he was falling in love with her. He had been falling since the moment she asked her question in the saloon, or perhaps since the morning she had spread the surveys on the kitchen table, or perhaps since the first moment she had walked through his office door and given him her name clearly and carefully, because she knew it mattered and suspected it wouldn't be remembered. He did not say any of this at the church social. He walked her home afterward, and they stood again on the Birch House boardwalk, and the evening was wide and quiet and full of the specific tension of things that had not yet been said. "You're different at the social," she said. "How so?" "Less armed," she said, in a manner of speaking. He looked at the street for a moment. "I don't do well with being managed," he said, deliberately echoing her own words back to her, and saw by her expression that she recognized them. "Neither of us does," she said. "That's either a problem or an advantage, depending on how you look at it." "How do you look at it?" She met his eyes. "I think two people who don't manage each other, who deal straight and talk plainly and let the other person be who they actually are, that's not a problem," she said. "That's rare." He looked at her and thought that rare was exactly the right word, and that he had known it since he first heard her use the difference between legal ownership and belonging in the same sentence. "Penelope," he said, her name sitting differently in his mouth now than it had in his office, different again from the boardwalk after the saloon, changing each time like something that was becoming more itself through use. "Dylan," she said, with a small, careful smile that was also a question. "I would like very much," he said, "for this to continue." She looked at him for a long moment with those reading eyes. "This being, you knowing me," he said, "and me knowing you, whatever that becomes." It was possibly the most vulnerable sentence he had spoken in years, and he felt it acutely, standing there in the warm night and watched her take it in. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd like that too." She went inside. He walked back to the Marshal's office through the quiet streets of Caldwell, and felt something he could only describe as light, which was not a word he associated with himself, but seemed, in this moment, accurate. In the following weeks, the legal situation resolved with the efficiency that Samuel Pratt's reputation had promised. The water rights were filed and confirmed. Stokes's lawyers mounted one additional challenge, withdrew it within a week when it became clear that Pratt had 3 times the documentation they had expected, and Harold Stokes called off the dispute. He did it, Dillon suspected, partly because the legal position was untenable and partly because he had been made quietly but clearly aware that the Marshal of Caldwell had documentation of his previous behaviors that would become considerably more relevant if he continued to pursue the matter. Stokes sent Penelope a letter. It was not an apology. It was a formal withdrawal of all claims and a business-like expression of goodwill going forward. She read it, folded it, put it with her legal files, and went back to work on the barn. Dillon rode out to the property on a Tuesday morning in early September when the air had begun to turn toward fall, and found her in the south field, directing the 2 men from the livery in the business of repairing a fence line. She saw him coming and walked over, wiping her hands on her work apron, her hair tied back, her face bright with exertion and the particular satisfaction of work that was going well. "It's done," he said. "Pratt's confirmation came through the county clerk yesterday. The water rights are yours, properly recorded." She stopped walking. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression that was not the careful composure or the burning fury of the saloon or even the careful warmth of the dinners and the evenings. It was something simpler and more fundamental. "Mine," she said. "Yours," he said. She looked at the land around her, the field and the fence line and the barn in the middle distance and the blue Kansas sky above it. And he watched her face in the moment when a thing she had been fighting for became real, and thought that he had seen men receive news of great victories with less emotion than she was showing in her quietly overwhelmed face. "My uncle never knew my mother very well," she said after a moment. "He left her this land and she never saw it, but she would have. She would have loved it here. She loved open places." She paused. "I think I'm here because it's the place I'm supposed to be, not just because it's legally mine." He remembered her saying exactly that in the farmhouse kitchen over the surveys 2.5 weeks ago, the difference between a right and something else. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." She looked at him then with an expression that had moved past guarded entirely. "Do you know," she said, "that you are the only person who has ever told me that what I thought was correct, not because I needed agreement or reassurance, but just because it was right and you recognized it." He didn't know what to say for a moment. Then he said, "You generally are correct." She laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it was the first time he had heard it, and it was, completely without his permission, the best sound he had encountered in recent memory. "I've been waiting," she said, "to know whether this place was home, whether it could be." She looked at him steadily. "I think part of what makes a place home is the people in it, or a person." The space between them was very charged and very particular, and he was aware of it with every part of his attention. He stepped closer. She did not step back. He was close enough now that he could see the exact warmth in her eyes and the slight uncertainty at the edge of her expression that told him she was as unsteadied by this as he was, which he found immeasurably steadying. "I am not," he said carefully, "a simple man to be near." "I know that," she said. "You are not simple at all, which is one of the things I find most remarkable about you, given that simple is what most people would assume from looking at you." "What do most people assume from looking at me?" he said. "Authority, efficiency, distance." She tilted her head slightly. "And none of those things are wrong, but they're not the whole picture." He reached out and took her hand. It was a deliberate thing, not impulsive. He had considered it and chosen it, which was how he did most things. But it was also the most forward thing he had done in years, and he felt the significance of it in a physical way that was somewhat alarming. Her hand was warm and work roughened, and her fingers closed around his without hesitation. They stood in the south field in the early September morning, with the fence men diplomatically occupied at the far end of the line, and the Kansas sky overhead, and the certainty between them of something that had been moving toward this moment since the beginning, and had, like a body of water finding its level, arrived. He kissed her, eventually, or she kissed him. It happened in the way that things between two people who have been circling the same point finally happen, both of them arriving at the same moment from slightly different directions, and it was warm and careful and entirely itself. When they separated, she looked at him with those clear reading eyes and said, "Well, that confirms several things." "It does," he said. She smiled at him, fully and without reservation, and he thought, holding her hand in the south field of the Ashford property on a Tuesday morning in September of 1882, that he had been building a wall against this kind of thing for so many years that he had genuinely believed the wall was permanent. It turned out walls that are built against the wrong things don't hold forever. They hold until the right person arrives and asks the right question, and then they do not hold at all. The autumn in Caldwell was golden and wide and full. Penelope moved out of the Birch House Hotel and into the farmhouse, which she had spent 6 weeks rendering livable in the most determined and practical way imaginable. The curtains were a good heavy cotton she had bought from the dry goods store. The floors were swept and sound. The kitchen had been cleaned to a state that Clara Mabry, on her first visit, pronounced more than adequate, which coming from Clara was high praise. Dillon came to the farmhouse for supper on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which had been established not by explicit agreement, but by the gradual settling into a pattern of two people who want to see each other, and have negotiated this through frequency rather than declaration. He brought things when he came: coffee once, a good knife for the kitchen, a set of books he had in his office that he thought she would like, which turned out to be correct. She was reading Middlemark when he arrived one Thursday evening, and she read him 2 sentences of it while he was hanging up his coat, and he said he had read it, and she expressed surprise. And he said he had been alone for a long time, and there was a lot of winter in Kansas, and she laughed again. That real unguarded laugh that he had decided was one of his favorite sounds in the world. They talked about everything, about the land and what she was planning to do with it, a small cattle operation of her own, nothing that required extensive hired help. The creek meant the cattle could water themselves easily, and she had already spoken to a rancher 2 counties over about a reasonable price for a small starter herd. About his work, which she asked about seriously, and listened to seriously in a way that he had not experienced much. Most people were either frightened of the details or romanticized them, and she did neither. About their respective histories, the years before Caldwell, the things they had carried along the way. He told her about his brother, who had died of cholera in 1873 in a small town in Missouri. He had not spoken about this to anyone in years, not because it was a secret, but because there was no one he wanted to tell it to. He found himself telling her on a Thursday evening over coffee after supper, simply and plainly, the way you tell someone something when you trust them to hold it carefully. She told him about her mother, who had been a woman of considerable intelligence and no formal education, who had read everything she could get her hands on, and had taught Penelope the same hunger for understanding the world. She would have liked you, Penelope said. She had very little patience for men who were clever only for their own benefit, but a great deal of respect for men who were clever in the service of something real. "Am I clever?" he said, with the slight self-deprecating tone that she had discovered he used when something touched him, and he wasn't ready to show it entirely. "Don't fish," she said, which made him laugh, low and genuine. And that was perhaps the best moment yet, because she had learned that his laugh was rarer than almost anything, and when it arrived, it was absolutely real. On an evening in late October, when the air had sharpened to the real edge of fall, and the sky had gone the deep, particular blue that precedes winter, Dylan stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse and watched Penelope make coffee and thought about what he was going to say. He had been thinking about it for 2 weeks. He was not a man who acted without thinking, and he had thought about this from every angle available. She set the coffee pot on the stove and turned around and found him looking at her with an expression she had learned to read, the specific expression that appeared when he had something to say and was assembling the words carefully. "You're working up to something," she said. "I am," he admitted. She leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at him with her full attention, the way she always gave things her full attention, which was one of the things about her he had loved from before he knew he loved it. He said, "I want to marry you. That is what I want. I want to spend the rest of whatever life I have being honest with you and knowing you and being near you. I want to be the person who knows your name in every room you walk into for the rest of your life." He paused. "I know I'm not easy. I know I work too much, and I don't talk enough, and I spent 10 years building walls that I am still in the process of taking down. I am not offering you simple. I'm offering you real." The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee pot began to tick softly on the stove. Penelope looked at him with those clear, reading, extraordinary eyes, and her composure was gone entirely, not in the direction of distress, but in the direction of being moved beyond the need for it. "Dylan," she said, and her voice was very soft. "From the moment I walked into your office and told you my name and you wrote it down and I thought you might not remember it, I was already trying not to want you to." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her in the October kitchen, with the coffee beginning to smell of warmth, it was entirely different from the south field in September. It was the difference between possibility and certainty, he discovered, was considerably better. "Yes," she said, against his shoulder. "Of course, yes." They were married in December of 1882 in the Caldwell Church on a Saturday afternoon. The ceremony was performed by the town's minister, a practical man named Reverend Holt, who had married several dozen couples in his tenure, and had a good eye for the real ones. Clara Mabry was there with flowers from the last of her autumn garden, dried lavender and rosehips, and the pale winter stalks of something that had been bright in summer. Chester Munn stood up as Dylan's witness, and took the responsibility seriously, to the point of wearing a coat he had clearly purchased specifically for the occasion. The town of Caldwell, which had not known Penelope Ashford's name 2 months ago, turned out in numbers that surprised her. The storekeeper's wife sat in the 2nd row. The restaurant owner was there. Samuel Pratt had come down from Wichita specifically, and stood near the back with the expression of a man who was glad he had taken the case. Gerald Foss had also come. He had sent a letter first, asking if his presence would be welcome, which Penelope had found both considerate and moving, and she had written back that it would be very welcome indeed. He was a small, neat man in his 60s who had known her mother years ago, and had tears in his eyes when Penelope came down the aisle in a dress that she and Clara had made together. A deep winter ivory with blue at the collar, her hair properly up and her eyes entirely clear. Dylan watched her come down the aisle and felt nothing he could have organized into words, only the vivid and wordless reality of this woman walking toward him in the clear December light. The woman who had been nameless in a room and was now the person he was going to spend his life learning. The vows were traditional, and they said them looking directly at each other, which was not always how people said vows in that church, but which neither of them had considered doing differently. When Dylan said "I will" with the plain certainty that was characteristic of him saying anything he meant completely, Penelope's expression was the one he had first seen in the south field, the one past guarded, and it was still the most remarkable thing he had seen at any distance. They signed the register. They walked out of the church into the cold, bright December day, and people they knew, and some they barely knew, came to offer congratulations. And Penelope stood in the middle of it with her hand in Dylan's, and received them with warmth. Not the controlled civility of a woman managing a foreign room, but the genuine warmth of someone who had, finally and fully, arrived. Dylan stood beside her and thought that this was what belonging looked like. Not the legal kind, not the right kind, but the real kind, and that she had known the difference between the two before he had, and this was one of the reasons she was remarkable. The winter was a good one, in the specific way that first winters in a shared life are good, full of the small, continuous intimacy of two people learning each other's daily rhythms and finding them compatible in ways and incompatible in others, and working out the difference with the patience of people who are committed to the working out. Dylan learned that she woke earlier than him and was sharply functional from the first moment, which he was not. She learned that he needed 40 minutes of quiet in the evening to decompress from the day before he was ready to be social, which she adapted to easily and without complaint. He moved into the farmhouse, which involved a conversation about the Marshal's obligations and the living situation that they resolved practically. He kept his office in town, and Chester Munn moved into the back rooms, and Dylan rode to town in the morning and back to the farmhouse in the evening, which was a 4-mile ride that he found he did not mind at all. She got her cattle. In February, she drove 24 head of good Kansas stock from the rancher 2 counties over, with 2 hired hands helping for the 3-day drive, and Dylan rode alongside on the last day as they came in across the western fields, her cattle, her land, her creek running ice-free under the winter sky, and she watched them come onto her property with an expression that he recognized as the South Field look again, the one that said, "This is real, and I am really here." Spring came, and with it the busy season of both the land and the law, because spring in Caldwell brought the first cattle drives up from Texas, and with them the particular variety of complication that Dylan had been managing for years and was well equipped to manage still. Penelope listened to him talk through the strategies and logistics of keeping a trail town functional during drive season with genuine interest, and occasionally pointed observations that became, almost without either of them noticing, a regular part of how he thought through problems. "You should be a lawyer," he said to her once, watching her disassemble an argument about grazing rights with the same efficiency she applied to fence repair. "I've considered it," she said, with the specific tone that told him she was completely serious, and he looked at her and thought that she absolutely should, and said so. And she looked at him with the expression she reserved for when he did something that reminded her that this was different from what she had expected, and said she would look into correspondence courses from the university. She did. By summer she was studying law through correspondence with a professor in Lawrence, Kansas, and Dylan had quietly put the word out to Samuel Pratt that there was a woman in Caldwell who was going to be a capable lawyer in a few years, and that Pratt might consider keeping her in mind. The summer of 1883 was warm and full and good. The cattle operation was small but healthy. The land was productive. The water rights were documented and secure, and Harold Stokes, whom Dylan sometimes saw at the county meetings, was civil and correct, and, Dylan suspected, privately admiring of how badly he had miscalculated the woman who now owned the Ashford property. Ray Dunbar had left Caldwell in the spring, headed west, and nobody particularly missed him. In July, On an evening when the summer was at its height, and the air smelled of warm grass, and the creak could be heard from the back porch of the farmhouse if you were quiet enough, Penelope came out onto the porch where Dylan was sitting with a cup of coffee and sat beside him and took his hand and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. Her expression was careful and bright at once. "We're going to have a child," she said. The evening was very still. The creek spoke softly. The last light lay gold across the fields. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman he had married in December, who had arrived in his town with 2 leather bags and a lawyer's letter, and a name she had to give him herself because he hadn't asked, who had taught him, without intending to teach him anything, that walls are not the same as strength, and that knowing someone's name is not a passive thing but an active one, a choice made in the direction of another person. "Penelope," he said. "Dylan," she said, with the smile that was hers alone. He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment, his eyes closed, and felt the full weight and rightness of everything that had led to this porch and this evening and this news and this woman. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly. He opened his eyes and looked at her with the kind of directness he had spent most of his life using only in professional capacity, all of it, nothing held back or measured. "Yes," he said, profoundly. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the last summer light and listened to the creek and the ordinary sounds of the land that was hers and now theirs. And the future was ahead of them like a good road in clear weather. Their son was born in March of 1884 on a Tuesday, because all the significant things in Dylan Ivers's life seemed to happen on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he had long since stopped questioning the pattern. Clara Mabry attended the birth along with the town doctor, a steady man named Dr. Hartwell, who had been delivering babies in Caldwell for 15 years, and had the calm, unhurried competence of someone who had seen most of what could happen and had a plan for it. Dylan waited in the kitchen and was extremely not calm, which was not a state he had much experience managing, and which Chester Munn, who had come without being asked because Chester was that kind of young man, handled by making coffee and finding things to clean, when Dr. Hartwell came to the kitchen doorway and said everything was well and they had a healthy boy. Dylan stood up from the kitchen table and had the brief but complete experience of a man whose legs have forgotten their primary function, and recovered with dignity intact only because Chester was very carefully looking at the ceiling. He went in. Penelope was propped up against the pillows with the specific exhausted radiance of a woman who has just done something enormous and knows it, and is simultaneously undone and entirely triumphant. She had the baby in her arms, small and dark-haired and outraged by everything about his current situation. "Come and meet your son," she said. Dylan sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and felt things that were entirely beyond his vocabulary in their depth and complexity, and simply felt them without attempting to translate them. "What shall we call him?" Penelope said. They had talked about names. They had not decided, both of them being people who wanted to see the thing before naming it. Dylan looked at the small, absolutely real person making his displeasure known at the Kansas morning. "Thomas," he said. "For your uncle who left you the land." Penelope looked at him. Her expression was the Southfield look and the October kitchen look, and every other look she had given him when he did something that she had not expected from the man she thought he was before she knew the man he actually was. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Ivers was a loud and determined infant who became a loud and determined child with his mother's dark eyes and his father's jaw and his own particular character, which from early on displayed a tendency to make up his mind quickly and then execute without hesitation, which he had clearly gotten from both of them. He grew up on the farm and in the town, trailing behind his father on the Marshal's rounds when he was old enough to be trusted not to cause international incidents. Sitting at the kitchen table, while his mother studied her correspondence law books and making careful marks in a child's primer of his own. He knew every person in Caldwell by name from the age of 6, because his mother had made a point of teaching him that knowing someone's name was not a passive thing, but an active choice made in the direction of another person. Penelope completed her law study in 1886, and Samuel Pratt, who had been quietly prepared for this moment for 2 years, offered her a position as a junior associate with his Wichita firm with the option of handling cases in Caldwell County, which was exactly the arrangement she had been hoping for. She worked from an office she established in town, a rented room above the dry goods store that she furnished simply and practically, and her first clients were people who had been unable to afford legal help and whose cases had been dismissed or ignored accordingly. She won 3 of the first 4 cases she took. The 4th she would have won, but the opposing lawyer raised a procedural challenge that she noted and adjusted for in every subsequent filing. She told Dylan about it over supper, and he listened and asked the right questions, and when she had worked through the problem out loud, he said, "You're going to win every one after this." And she said, "I know." And they looked at each other across the supper table with Thomas eating his potatoes between them and the farm outside and the life they had built all around them, real and solid and entirely theirs. "He was waiting," Penelope said, "without knowing he was waiting. For you," Clara said. Penelope considered this. "For someone to be worth opening to," she said. "I was the person it happened to be. I'm glad it was me." Clara looked at her with the expression she reserved for things that were true and also beautiful. "You are not simply the person it happened to be," she said. "You went and asked the room if anyone knew your name. That is not a small thing." It was not a small thing. Penelope knew that. She had known it in the moment she said it. The desperate clarity of it. Standing in the silver rail with the legal document folded against her ribs, and 2 weeks of namelessness pressing on her, looking at the man at the end of the bar who she suspected, under all his armor, was more than the wall he had built. She had been right. She had taken the risk of saying the truest thing she could say in that moment, not knowing what would happen, and it had shaken something loose in him that had been waiting to be shaken. Second child came in the spring of 1888. Announced on a porch evening as Thomas had been announced, this time with a good deal more calm from all parties, including Dylan, who had by now had enough experience with significant domestic events, that he was able to receive the information with the warm steadiness that characterized everything he did when he was being most himself. A daughter, this time. Born on a Thursday in April when the Kansas spring was doing everything spring in Kansas does, which is to say turning the world rapidly from brown to improbably green with the kind of enthusiasm that seemed excessive after the winter. They named her Eleanor, for Penelope's mother. Eleanor Ivers had her father's gray eyes and her mother's mouth, and a temperament that was, from the beginning, entirely her own. Placid where Thomas was loud, observational where Thomas was active, with a steady intelligence that made her parents look at each other above her head with the specific expression of 2 people who are both thinking the same thing. Thomas took his role as older brother with a seriousness that made Penelope cry twice in the first month. Quiet private tears of the specific kind that come from watching your child be unexpectedly good. He brought Eleanor rocks, which he carefully explained to her, and since Eleanor could not yet indicate her opinion of rocks, she listened gravely, which Thomas found entirely satisfactory. Dylan watched his children and his wife in the farmhouse that had been cleaned and mended and made into a home by the particular combination of Penelope's determination, and his own quiet investment in building things that lasted, and felt the specific ongoing gratitude of someone who knows they came close to something that almost didn't happen. It had almost not happened. If he had answered her question in the saloon, dismissed it, returned to his conversation, let her walk out without following. If he had been slightly more armored, slightly less moved, slightly less honest on the boardwalk that first night. If she had been less brave, less herself, less willing to ask the truest question in a room full of people who didn't deserve to hear it. The margin was thin. He thought about it sometimes, the way you think about a road you almost didn't take. In 1889, Caldwell was growing. The cattle trade had shifted, and the town was becoming more settled, more permanent, with new buildings going up and families arriving, and the specific transition from frontier outpost to small city beginning its slow work. Dylan had been Marshal for 11 years and had been approached twice about running for county sheriff, which was a larger jurisdiction and a different kind of work. He talked to Penelope about it. She sat across the kitchen table with her law book stacked at her elbow, and Thomas doing something noisy in the yard and Alina asleep in the next room, and listened to him lay out the considerations with the careful fairness he applied to every decision. "What do you want?" she asked when he had finished. "I want your opinion," he said. "I know that," she said with a smile. "What do you want?" He thought about it. He looked at the farm around him, at the kitchen where she had told him about Thomas. At the south field he could see through the window where she had told him the water rights were confirmed, and the land was hers, and she had laughed in a way he had only heard a handful of times before that. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want Caldwell," she nodded. "Then stay," she said. "The county doesn't need you the way Caldwell does. And frankly, I don't want to move Thomas's school situation. And I'm in the middle of the Richards case, and Alina just started eating solid food without throwing it, which is a considerable achievement that I'd like to see consolidated before any major changes are made." He looked at her. She was completely serious about all of it, the case and the solid food and the school situation and the very clear message underneath all of it, that Caldwell was home and home was worth keeping. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and went back to her books. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to Thomas in the yard and the sound of Penelope turning pages and the quiet breathing of the house around him. This house that had been a stranger's barn and a legal dispute, and a question asked in a saloon before it became this, the most specific and real thing he had, the center of his life. He thought about what she had said on one of those first evenings, that what makes a place home is the people in it, or a person. And then she had looked at him with the careful question in her eyes, and he had taken her hand in the south field, and everything had been decided by the simple fact of her fingers closing around his. It had been 7 years. The wall was gone, or most of it, the parts that had mattered most. What was left was the structure of him, the careful and honest and occasionally still too quiet man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to ask him the right question. She had asked it in a saloon at the worst moment of her first 2 weeks in a new town, to a room that didn't deserve to answer it, looking at a man she had not yet decided whether to trust. He had walked out after her. He had said her name on a street in the dark. He had told her she mattered in the plainest possible sentence, and meant it more than he had meant anything in years. And that had been, in the way of everything that actually matters, the beginning. The years settled into themselves with the particular rightness of things that have found their proper shape. Thomas grew into a serious, curious boy who rode with his father on Saturday mornings and argued fine legal points with his mother at the supper table, a habit she encouraged, and Dylan found simultaneously exhausting and admirable. Alina grew into a girl who could sit in the south field for an hour watching the creek and come back with an accurate count of every bird species she had observed, which she reported to her parents with the straight-faced certainty of a future naturalist. Clara Mabry, who had become in the way of certain people the permanent and irreplaceable heart of Penelope's life in Caldwell, came to supper every Sunday and argued with Thomas about history, and told Alina stories about the early years of the territory that made the girl's eyes go wide. She was in her 60s now and sharp as ever and had opinions about everything, and was never wrong by very much. Chester Munn married a woman named Helen in 1890, a schoolteacher who arrived from Ohio and was thoroughly unimpressed by the West's reputation for lawlessness, which she attributed to insufficient education, and Chester loved her completely and immediately. Penelope was at the wedding. Dylan stood as Chester's witness and felt something straightforward and warm about the occasion, which was the kind of feeling he had once been unable to locate and now found arrived fairly regularly. Samuel Pratt offered Penelope a full partnership in 1891. She accepted. The partnership was conducted mostly by correspondence and the occasional trip to Wichita, which she made 3 or 4 times a year, and which Dylan managed in her absence by having Thomas help with the afternoon chores, and Alina explained the livestock situation to him in the thorough detail she considered necessary for anyone approaching a cow. On an October evening in 1891, sitting on the back porch of the farmhouse in the same configuration they had sat in on the July evening 7 years ago when she had told him about Thomas, the creek talking in the dark and the sky full of the specific stars of a Kansas autumn, Penelope said, "I've been thinking about the saloon." He looked at her. "The silver rail." "September of '82, she said. "I have thought about that moment more times than I can count, what I was feeling, what it cost to say that out loud." "What was it costing you?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Everything," she said simply. "It was the moment where I either gave in to the feeling that I didn't exist here, that I had come to a place that was never going to let me in, or I said it out loud and made it real, and real things can be responded to. Invisible things can't." She paused. "I was terrified." He looked at her in the dark. She said this plain and matter of fact, not asking for reassurance about the past, but just telling him the truth of it because they told each other the truth of things. "I was watching you the whole time," he said. "In the room. I could see what was happening to your face. I kept waiting for myself to say something and I didn't, and then you asked the question and the room went quiet and you were looking at me." "I was looking at you," she confirmed, "because you were the one person I was most angry at and also the one I had the most hope for, which is a terrible combination." "I know," he said. "I could see that too. And you followed me," she said. "I followed you," he said. "I was on my feet before I knew I was moving." She looked at the dark field and the sky. "I have thought about," she said carefully, "whether you would have followed me if I had said it differently, if I had been quieter or more polite or more contained. And I think the answer is that you would not have. You would have done your job, helped with the legal problem, maintained the appropriate distance, and that would have been that." He thought about this honestly, which was the only way he thought about things she said. "You might be right," he said. "So the question was necessary," she said. "Not just for the room, for you needed to hear someone ask to be seen." He was quiet for a long time. The creek spoke in the dark. "Yes," he said at last. "I think I did." She took his hand in the way she had taken it 100 times in 7 years, the particular grip that was hers and that he had memorized completely. "I'm glad I asked," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." They sat together on the porch of the farmhouse on the land that had been hers and was now theirs, in the life they had built from a legal dispute, and a saloon question, and a name said plainly on a dark street. And the stars were the same stars that had been above this land for 10,000 years and would be above it for 10,000 more. And within them, everything was quiet and right and fully, completely home. The spring of 1892 brought the kind of Kansas weather that tests every structure. 3 weeks of rain followed by a cold snap that frosted the early crops and kept everyone inside and short-tempered. The farmhouse roof held, which Dylan took quiet personal satisfaction in because he had spent 2 Saturdays the previous autumn reinforcing it with Thomas's enthusiastic assistance and Aliner's supervisory commentary. By April the weather had softened again, and the land was doing what it did in spring, returning to itself with the extravagance of something that has been held back and is now released. The cattle were healthy. The creek was running high and clear. Thomas had a new interest in tracking, which he pursued with the intensity that characterized him, and Aliner had begun pressing flowers between the pages of her father's books, which he discovered, and said nothing about because the flowers were beautiful and the books were none the worse. Penelope won the Richards case in late April. She wrote to Samuel Pratt about it, and he wrote back that he had expected nothing less, and that 3 people in Wichita had asked about her in the past month. She told Dylan about the letter at breakfast, and he read it and handed it back to her and said, "Pratt is not a man who uses words carelessly. 3 people in a month means your reputation is arriving before you do." She folded the letter and looked at him with the expression he had been seeing for 9 years now, the one that said he had done the specific thing she needed rather than the generic supportive thing, and he was still as struck by it as he had ever been. "Do you know," she said, "I never thought when I stepped off that stage with my 2 bags and my legal letter that this is what I would be doing 9 years later." "What did you think you would be doing?" he said. "Surviving," she said honestly. "Getting through the next thing." That was how I had been living for a few years, just getting through. He looked at her across the breakfast table, this woman who had walked into his office and given him her name and become the fact of his life. "And now," he said. She looked at the kitchen around her, at the sound of Thomas's voice from outside and Aliner's steady footfall on the stairs, at the maps and the law books and the coffee and the window with the spring light coming through. "Now," she said, "I'm living." He reached across the table and took her hand in his, the same hand he had taken in the South Field, the hand he had been holding in one way or another since the beginning of everything, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Outside, Thomas was explaining something to the dog with the full seriousness of his 10 years, and Aliner was coming down the stairs with a new flower already in her pocket for pressing. And the creek was running clear on the western edge of 40 acres that had been a legal dispute and was now a home. And the Marshal of Caldwell rode the same roads he had always ridden and came back every evening to the farmhouse, and the woman who had asked the question that changed the answer to everything. This was the life. Not the life he had expected or planned or built deliberately in any of the ways he was accustomed to building things. The life that had arrived in July on a stage from Wichita, with dark eyes and a lawyer's letter, and a name given clearly and carefully to a man who almost didn't write it down with the weight it deserved. He had written it down. He had kept it. He had followed her into the street. The rest was morning coffee and supper conversations, and a son who asked 400 questions, and a daughter who counted birds, and a woman who had turned his careful distance into something he no longer needed, not because she had taken it from him, but because she had given him something better to replace it with. Her name was Penelope Ivers, born Penelope Ashford, in this town known and spoken and considered. The woman who had taught a cold Marshal that knowing a person's name is not a passive thing, but the first and most important choice you can make in the direction of another human being. And he had made it. Every single day he made it.